Episode 37, The day nothing changed at 7:02 a.m. Eastern Time, the world woke up. Nothing happened. No emergency broadcasts interrupted morning television. No power grids failed. No cities went dark. No transportation systems collapsed. No government alerts appeared on phones. No long lines formed outside grocery stores. The world simply continued. In Boston, commuters waited for trains. In Dallas, delivery drivers loaded packages. In Phoenix, coffee shops opened their doors. In Seattle, office lights turned on floor by floor as workers arrived carrying backpacks, laptops, and paper cups. Across America, millions of people woke expecting to feel something. Fear. Relief. Excitement. Proof. Most people felt tired. And that was the first problem. Because human beings expect important moments to announce themselves. People imagine history arriving loudly. History is supposed to sound like sirens. Or applause. Or panic. Not traffic. Not weather forecasts. Not somebody checking whether they forgot to answer an email. Inside the control room, Daniel Kessler stood quietly in front of the displays. Months earlier, this room had felt different. The air had felt heavier. Every screen mattered. Every fluctuation created tension. Every tiny deviation triggered discussion. Now dozens of displays continued running normally. Prediction models updated. Traffic systems updated. Energy systems updated. Communication systems updated. Everything moved. Nothing broke. The technician refreshed a screen. Then refreshed again. Then once more. Finally he looked toward Daniel. So what happens now? Daniel continued watching data. The question stayed in the room for several seconds. Finally he answered. It already happened. The technician frowned. What happened? Daniel pointed toward the displays. That. The technician looked confused. Everything looks normal. Daniel nodded. That is what people expected to disappear. The analyst sitting nearby adjusted several graphs. Market indicators. Infrastructure stability. Resource allocation. Supply chain forecasting. All green. Mostly. He looked uncomfortable. This cannot be right. Daniel looked toward him. Why? The analyst pointed at the screens. Because yesterday changed everything. Daniel answered quietly. No. Pause. It changed who decides. Silence. Because the sentence sounded important. But not satisfying. Across the world, Eleanor Hayes stood inside the archive. Morning sunlight moved through tall windows and stretched across shelves filled with records. Reports. Maps. Old models. Failed predictions. Histories of decisions nobody remembered making. Michael Carter walked beside her carrying coffee. You feel it? Yes. What changed? Eleanor looked around the archive. Then toward the windows. Then toward people walking outside. She answered slowly. People. Michael waited. She continued. Nothing else changed yet. The answer bothered him immediately. Because if only people changed, why did everything still look identical? At 7:28 a.m., morning news programs adjusted their tone. Traffic moving normally. Markets opening normally. Infrastructure stable. No disruptions reported. Commentators smiled. Experts relaxed. Words like resilience appeared. Words like stability returned. Across social media, jokes appeared. Maybe people overreacted. Maybe predictions were exaggerated. Maybe all the warnings were wrong. Inside homes across the country, millions of tiny conclusions quietly formed. Maybe nothing happened. A man in Ohio turned off the television and left for work. He would later take a road he had never used before. A woman in Florida checked gas prices and shrugged. A student in Colorado complained about homework. A warehouse manager in Nevada reviewed inventory numbers and saw nothing unusual. Normal. 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 Eleanor quietly spoke. That is dangerous. Michael looked toward her. What is dangerous? She answered, when people stop looking. Back inside the control room, the technician pointed toward predictive models. 99.2%. Pause. 98.8. He frowned. So what? Daniel walked closer. Prediction confidence had decreased slightly. Routing certainty had decreased slightly. Behavioral consistency had decreased slightly. Nothing dramatic. Tiny percentages. Tiny movements. Tiny uncertainty. The technician shook his head. We changed everything for this? Daniel answered, no. Pause. We changed everything for what comes after this. The technician looked confused. What comes after? Daniel stared at imperfect data streams moving slowly across displays. Finally he answered, the part nobody notices. Outside the control room windows, sunlight reflected across buildings. Cars moved through intersections. People bought coffee. Parents walked children into schools. Workers unlocked doors. Phones rang. Packages moved. Airplanes landed. The world continued. And because the world continued, millions of people quietly decided the danger had passed. At exactly 8 a.m. Eastern Time, confidence returned. Too quickly. Because certainty always returns faster than understanding. Humans do not wait long before deciding everything is fine. Daniel continued watching the displays. The analyst finally asked, are we waiting for something? Daniel answered quietly. No. Pause. It already started. What started? Daniel looked at thousands of imperfect data points moving across dozens of screens. Then answered softly, the dangerous part. Because sometimes, the most important day in history, looks ordinary enough to ignore. At 8:19 a.m. Eastern Time, people started looking. For proof. Not scientists. Not governments. Everyone. Because human beings do not trust invisible change. Because invisible change feels temporary. Visible change feels real. Across the country, millions of tiny investigations quietly began. In Chicago, commuters checked train arrival times against yesterday. In Los Angeles, drivers opened navigation applications and compared traffic estimates. In Houston, logistics managers refreshed routing dashboards. In Miami, investors watched futures markets. In Denver, warehouse supervisors checked delivery forecasts. People searched for evidence. Most found normal. Which felt comforting. And dangerous. Inside the control room, the technician pointed toward prediction models. 99.1. Pause. 98.7. He looked confused. That is it. Daniel walked closer. Dozens of screens continued updating. Behavioral prediction. Traffic prediction. Demand forecasting. Resource distribution. Weather impact modeling. Almost everything still worked. Almost. Daniel answered quietly. We changed the world for 1%. Daniel did not answer immediately. Because percentages create dangerous illusions. 1% sounds small. Until 1% appears everywhere. Across the room, the analyst adjusted several charts. His expression changed slowly. Then he looked up. It is spreading. The technician frowned. What is spreading? The analyst pointed. Uncertainty. He opened another display. Consumer behavior. Prediction confidence lower. Another display. Transportation patterns. Prediction confidence lower. Another display. Energy usage forecasting. Prediction confidence lower. Tiny changes. Everywhere. The technician still looked unconvinced. So what? The analyst answered quietly, I do not know. That bothered him. Because experts tolerate problems. Experts dislike uncertainty. Across the world, Eleanor Hayes continued reviewing old archived material. Old reports filled the shelves around her. Thousands of decisions. Thousands of models. Thousands of explanations written by people who believed they understood what would happen next. Michael Carter sat nearby. You expected this? No. What did you expect? Eleanor thought carefully. Then answered, something louder. Michael smiled slightly. Maybe loud comes later. Eleanor looked toward the large windows. Outside, pedestrians crossed intersections. Coffee shops filled with customers. Buses arrived. Construction crews unloaded equipment. Everything looked ordinary. She answered quietly, or maybe this is loud. Michael frowned. What do you mean? She pointed outside. Look carefully. He looked. Nothing unusual. She continued, people expected transformation. Pause. So now they are searching for confirmation. Michael looked confused. That sounds normal. Eleanor nodded. It is. Pause. Which is why it matters. At 8:57 a.m., news coverage changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. Morning programs stopped asking whether systems remain stable. Instead they asked, how stable? Financial analysts stopped saying predictable. They started saying mostly predictable. Infrastructure specialists stopped saying optimized. They started saying functioning normally. Tiny changes. Small words. Different language. Language always changes before people admit fear. Inside the control room, Daniel noticed immediately. They see it. The technician looked confused. See what? Daniel pointed toward news feeds. They stopped speaking with certainty. The technician shrugged. So? Daniel answered quietly. So they noticed. At 9:14 a.m., online discussions shifted. People started posting comparisons. Traffic screenshots. Energy prices. Commute times. Delivery estimates. Comments appeared, looks normal. Feels normal. Nothing changed. People laughed. People relaxed. People moved on. Confidence returned quickly. Perhaps too quickly. The analyst refreshed predictive models again. Then again. Then again. Finally he looked toward Daniel. We are losing precision. Daniel nodded. Yes. How much? Daniel looked carefully. Not enough for people to care. Pause. Yet. The technician leaned backward. I still do not understand. Daniel looked toward hundreds of moving data streams. Then answered, prediction is easy when people behave the same way. Pause. It becomes expensive when they do not. The room became quiet. Because everyone understood what expensive meant. More computation. More resources. More mistakes. More uncertainty. Outside the control room windows, sunlight reflected across office buildings. Morning slowly turned toward noon. People continued living normally. Phones rang. Packages moved. Meetings started. Meetings ended. Nothing dramatic happened. And that was exactly why almost nobody realized something important: the world still worked. But it had already become harder to predict. Sometimes, the first sign that history changed is not failure. It is confusion. At 10:11 a.m. Eastern Time, the first strange thing happened. Nobody noticed. Which made it important. Because important changes are easiest to miss when they look ordinary. Outside Columbus, Ohio, a distribution center processed nearly 40,000 packages before noon. Everything followed normal procedures. Scanning. Sorting. Loading. Routing. Nothing unusual. At 10:11 a.m., a supervisor reviewed truck assignments. Software recommended Route 7. The supervisor selected Route 9. He did not choose Route 9 because it was faster. Or cheaper. Or smarter. He simply stared at the screen for several seconds and thought, no. Route 9 feels better. He clicked confirm. 20 minutes later, Route 9 unexpectedly arrived first. Nobody noticed because the difference was only 4 minutes. The software recorded the result anyway. 3 minutes later, another employee manually adjusted loading priority. 5 minutes later, somebody changed scheduling order. Tiny changes. Unimportant individually. Invisible collectively. Inside the control room, an alert appeared. Minor behavioral variance increase. The technician looked toward the display. Then laughed. That triggered. Daniel leaned closer. Show me. Data appeared. Small deviations. Independent. Uncoordinated. Human. The analyst studied incoming information. Then quietly said, they are choosing differently. For years, prediction systems quietly assumed something: most humans prefer convenience. Convenience created patterns. Patterns created confidence. Confidence created dependence. Nobody noticed because dependence felt comfortable. The technician shrugged. People always choose. Daniel answered quietly, no. Pause. They used to follow. The technician frowned. What is the difference? Daniel pointed toward the screens. When prediction becomes expectation. Following feels like choosing. The room became quiet. Because everyone understood what he meant. At 10:24 a.m., more small changes appeared. In Phoenix, a coffee shop manager ignored inventory recommendations. In Atlanta, a dispatcher manually adjusted deliveries. In Minneapolis, a purchasing manager delayed an automated order. Not because systems failed. Because something felt wrong. Or unnecessary. Or incomplete. Nobody could explain why. Across the world, Eleanor Hayes stopped walking. Michael noticed immediately. What? She looked distant. Then answered quietly, it started. Michael looked around. The archive remained silent. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. What started? Eleanor answered, the small things. Michael frowned. That sounds insignificant. Eleanor smiled slightly. It always does. They continued walking between rows of records. Old models. Old predictions. Old assumptions. Michael finally asked, how can you tell? Eleanor touched the edge of an old report. Because people are doing something dangerous. What? She answered, using judgment. Michael laughed softly. That sounds normal. Eleanor looked toward him. No. Pause. That sounds human. At 10:41 a.m., financial systems noticed something unusual. Nothing alarming. Consumer purchasing became slightly harder to predict. Demand patterns shifted. Tiny forecasting errors appeared. Nothing large enough to create headlines. Large enough to create questions. Inside the control room, prediction confidence continued falling. 96.3. 95.9. 95.4. The technician looked increasingly frustrated. "We are talking about decimals." Daniel nodded. "Yes. So why does everyone here look worried?" The analyst answered before Daniel could speak. "Because the direction matters." The technician looked confused. "What direction?" The analyst pointed toward the displays. "Down." At 11:02 a.m., something even stranger appeared. People started ignoring recommendations. Not completely. Just slightly. Suggested routes ignored. Suggested products ignored. Suggested schedules adjusted. Tiny acts. Small refusals. Millions of them. Daniel watched carefully. Then asked, "Show recommendation acceptance rates." The analyst pulled data. Silence filled the room. The technician leaned forward. "That cannot be right." Recommendation compliance dropped. Not dramatically. Only a little. But everywhere. Daniel looked toward the screens. Then quietly said, "There." The technician looked confused. "What?" Daniel answered, "Proof." Across the world, Michael still looked unconvinced. People choosing differently does not sound important. Eleanor looked outside the archive windows. Pedestrians crossed streets. Cars stopped at lights. Workers entered buildings. Everything looked ordinary. She answered quietly, "Systems become powerful when humans become predictable." Pause. What happens when prediction weakens? Michael thought carefully. Finally, the systems weaken. Eleanor slowly nodded. Eventually. Pause. But first. She looked back toward shelves filled with decades of certainty. People stop understanding what is happening. At 11:19 a.m., social media continued joking. Memes appeared. People mocked previous warnings. Nothing collapsed. Nothing dramatic happened. The world still worked. Which made the changes harder to see. Inside the control room, Daniel continued staring at data. The technician finally asked, "When do people notice?" Daniel answered quietly, "When outcomes stop matching expectations." The technician frowned. "And when is that?" Daniel watched thousands of tiny deviations spread slowly across hundreds of systems. Then answered, "Soon." Because history rarely begins with collapse. Sometimes, history begins, when people quietly stop doing what they are expected to do. At 11:43 a.m. Eastern Time, experts started becoming uncomfortable. Not because forecasts became wrong. Because forecasts stopped sounding confident. That difference matters. People forgive mistakes. People fear uncertainty. Not because anything failed. Because everything still worked. Mostly. The problem was smaller. And therefore harder to explain. Inside offices across America, analysts refreshed dashboards more frequently. Not because they needed to. Because something felt different. In New York, financial forecasters adjusted confidence ranges. In Dallas, logistics companies increased monitoring frequency. In Seattle, predictive traffic systems requested additional data inputs. Nothing broke. But systems that normally felt certain suddenly felt cautious. Inside the control room, the analyst pointed toward a projection model. "We lost precision again." The technician looked frustrated. "How much?" 0.6%. The technician stared. "That is nothing." The analyst did not look convinced. "Yesterday it was 0.2. Silence. Because tiny numbers become dangerous when they move in one direction. Especially when nobody agrees where they stop. Daniel Kessler continued watching data streams. Prediction confidence. Behavioral modeling. Resource forecasting. Everything remained operational. But certainty kept shrinking. The technician finally asked, "When do we start worrying?" Daniel answered quietly, "When uncertainty spreads faster than understanding." The technician frowned. "What does that mean?" Daniel pointed toward dozens of screens. "Look. One display. Consumer demand. Less precise. Another. Transportation. Less precise. Another. Energy forecasting. Less precise. None alarming individually. Together, different." At 12:02 p.m., a weather analytics company quietly modified language inside internal reports. Not high confidence. Instead, moderately high confidence. Tiny wording changes. Tiny emotional changes. Tiny admissions. Across the world, Eleanor Hayes sat near archive windows while sunlight moved slowly across the floor. Michael Carter placed coffee beside her. "You look worried." "I am thinking." "About what?" Eleanor answered quietly, "What happens when people expect certainty?" Michael shrugged. "They get comfortable." Eleanor nodded. "Yes." Pause. "And comfort creates dependence." Michael sat down. "You think this is dependence?" Eleanor looked toward shelves filled with old reports. "These records cover decades." She touched a stack of archived forecasts. "Most people stopped deciding." Pause. "They started following." Michael looked unconvinced. "Following works." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Usually." Pause. "Until it becomes automatic." Outside the windows, pedestrians continued moving through city streets. Food trucks opened. Delivery drivers unloaded packages. Construction workers directed traffic. Everything looked ordinary. That bothered Eleanor. Because important things should feel important. At 12:17 p.m., news channels quietly changed language again. Instead of saying, "Everything remains stable," they started saying, "Systems remain stable for now." Tiny words. Small adjustments. But language reveals fear earlier than statistics do. Inside the control room, Daniel noticed immediately. They are adapting. The technician looked confused. "Who?" Daniel pointed toward news feeds. "Everyone." The analyst refreshed incoming reports. Then paused. "We have another problem." Daniel turned. "What?" The analyst hesitated. "People are checking more." The technician laughed. "So?" The analyst opened another display. Search traffic increased. Questions increased. Comparison behavior increased. People checking prices. Schedules. Traffic. Predictions. Recommendations. More than normal. Daniel understood immediately. They are measuring. The technician still looked confused. "Why does that matter?" Daniel answered, "Because when people start measuring, they start doubting." At 12:38 p.m., a university behavioral research group released a small observation. Nothing dramatic. Just a note. Human decision variance appears slightly elevated today. Nobody paid attention. The report disappeared beneath sports news and market coverage. Still, the observation existed. Across the archive, Michael asked. Quietly, "What if nothing actually changed?" Eleanor looked toward him. "You believe that?" Michael thought carefully. Then answered, "I believe people want simple answers." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Yes." Pause. Which is exactly why complicated changes survive. At 12:51 p.m., prediction confidence dropped again. 94.9. 94.5. 94.2. The technician stared. Still small. Still functioning. Still normal. Yet somehow, less certain. He finally asked, when does normal stop being normal? Daniel looked toward moving data streams. Then answered quietly, when checking stops feeling optional. Outside, afternoon sunlight covered highways, office buildings, parking lots, and sidewalks. The world continued. Cars moved. People worked. Packages shipped. Meetings started. Meetings ended. Nothing dramatic happened. And yet, for the first time, experts trusted tomorrow slightly less than yesterday. Sometimes, the first warning sign is not failure. Sometimes, it is hesitation. At 1:07 p.m. Eastern Time, people finally experienced consequences. Not collapse. Not failure. Friction. A commuter missed a familiar train by 40 seconds and took a different route home. Several lunch orders arrived at restaurants customers did not originally choose. Forecasts still worked. Just slightly worse. For most people, the difference felt annoying. Not important. That misunderstanding mattered. For the first time, prediction errors stopped feeling theoretical. Inside the control room, the technician leaned backward in his chair. I do not understand. Nobody answered immediately. The technician continued. We expected resistance. Pause. We expected instability. Pause. We expected something. He pointed toward the displays. This looks like Tuesday. Daniel Kessler looked toward the screens. Prediction systems still worked. Supply chain still moved. Resource networks still balanced. Everything functioned. Mostly. Daniel answered quietly, yes. The technician looked frustrated. So why does everyone still look worried? Daniel remained silent. Because the answer sounded strange. Across America, lunchtime crowds filled restaurants. Office workers stood in line for sandwiches. Construction crews gathered around food trucks. Parents answered messages while waiting in school pickup lines. Normal. Ordinary. Forgettable. Across social media, jokes continued spreading. People compared warnings from previous weeks against reality. Nothing happened. Everything fine. Move on. Confidence grew. The analyst inside the control room looked uncomfortable. We have another issue. The technician sighed. What now? The analyst pointed toward engagement metrics. People stopped monitoring. The technician frowned. So? Daniel answered immediately. That matters. The technician looked confused. Why? Daniel answered, because attention disappeared. Humans rarely notice systems. They notice inconvenience. Across the world, Eleanor Hayes walked slowly through the archive. Michael followed. You keep saying this is dangerous. Yes. But why? Eleanor stopped near an old shelf filled with decades of reports. She removed one document. Prediction systems. 30 years old. She opened another. Optimization frameworks. 20 years old. Another. Behavioral adaptation studies. 15 years old. Michael looked confused. What are you showing me? Eleanor answered quietly, people do not fear systems. Pause. They fear visible systems. Michael looked around. And invisible ones? Eleanor placed the documents back. They become normal. At 1:24 p.m., financial analysts adjusted forecasts again. Not because models failed. Because confidence decreased. One analyst inside a New York office quietly changed wording. High confidence. Changed to moderate confidence. Nobody outside the company noticed. Inside the company, everyone noticed. Across transportation networks, something similar happened. Forecasting windows shortened. Buffer margins increased. Tiny defensive decisions appeared. Not dramatic. Practical. Human. Inside the control room, the technician stared toward screens. Everyone keeps adjusting. The analyst nodded. Yes. But why? Daniel answered, because uncertainty is expensive. The technician looked toward prediction confidence metrics. Still above 90%. Still strong. Still functional. He shook his head. This still feels small. Daniel looked toward hundreds of moving data streams. Then answered, large changes usually begin small. At 1:39 p.m., Eleanor and Michael sat near archive windows. Outside, sunlight reflected from office buildings. People crossed intersections carrying lunch. Buses stopped. Cars moved. Life continued. Michael finally asked, what if people stop caring? Eleanor looked outside. They will. Michael frowned. You sound certain. She nodded. Because humans cannot remain alert forever. Pause. The question is not whether they stop paying attention. Pause. The question is what happens after. Michael looked confused. After what? After normal becomes believable. Inside the control room, the analyst refreshed models again. Then stopped moving. Daniel noticed immediately. What? The analyst pointed. Prediction confidence stabilized. Resource usage did not. 94.1. Still lower. But stable. The technician smiled. There. See. Maybe we worried for nothing. Nobody answered immediately. Daniel continued watching the displays. Because stable and solved are different things. Very different things. At exactly 2 p.m. Eastern Time, millions of people quietly reached the same conclusion, nothing changed. The world still worked. It simply stopped feeling automatic. Because once people believe nothing changed, they stop looking. And when people stop looking, they stop noticing. Sometimes, the most important moment is not when history changes. Sometimes, it is when people decide history did not. At 2:18 p.m. Eastern Time, the first real problem appeared. Nobody called it a problem. Which made it worse. Inside offices across the country, people stopped checking. Search traffic decreased. Dashboards closed. People stopped refreshing screens. Attention quietly disappeared. The transportation analyst who refreshed dashboards every 10 minutes returned to normal monitoring. The warehouse supervisor who compared forecasts every hour moved on to paperwork. The financial teams who spent the morning looking for anomalies shifted back to meetings. Attention faded. Normal returned. Or at least, the feeling of normal returned. Inside the control room, the technician stretched and stood up. You want coffee? The analyst looked surprised. You are leaving? The technician shrugged. What for? He pointed toward the screens. Everything stabilized. Daniel Kessler remained standing. Watching. The technician noticed. You still think something is wrong? Daniel answered quietly, no. Pause. I think something changed. The technician smiled. Same difference. Daniel looked toward dozens of displays. No. Pause. It is not. At 2:31 p.m., recommendation systems across multiple industries noticed something unusual. Not failure. Not collapse. Reduced compliance. Customers ignored suggestions slightly more often. Drivers ignored optimized routes slightly more often. Managers overrode automated decisions slightly more often. Tiny percentages. Small enough that nobody considered them urgent. Large enough that algorithms noticed. Inside the control room, new metrics appeared. Recommendation acceptance. Down. Automation compliance. Down. Behavior consistency. Down. Conflicting recommendations appearing more often. The analyst looked uncomfortable. This is spreading. The technician returned holding coffee. He looked at the screens. Still colorful. Still functioning. Still normal. So. The analyst pointed. People are following less. The technician shrugged. Maybe people are stubborn. Daniel answered quietly, maybe. Or maybe people remember they can choose. Across the world, Eleanor Hayes stood near archive windows. Afternoon sunlight had changed. Long shadows stretched across shelves. Michael Carter looked tired. You still think this matters? Eleanor answered immediately. Yes. Michael looked outside. Everything remained ordinary. People crossing streets. Traffic lights changing. Restaurants filling. Delivery vans moving. He shook his head. I keep waiting. For what? Something visible. Eleanor smiled slightly. Humans always do. Michael frowned. What if visible never comes? Eleanor looked outside again. Then answered quietly, then people will create explanations. At 2:47 p.m., explanations started appearing. News commentators called the morning uncertainty temporary. Analysts called behavioral shifts noise. Financial experts called prediction drift expected variance. People always explain uncertainty quickly. Because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. And explanations are cheaper than uncertainty. Inside the control room, the technician pointed toward television feeds. There. Pause. Problem solved. Daniel asked quietly, you believe that? The technician looked confused. Do not you? Daniel watched commentators confidently explaining things they did not fully understand. Then answered, no. The analyst asked, why not? Daniel pointed toward prediction metrics. They are explaining uncertainty. Pause. While uncertainty continues growing. At 3:01 p.m., a transportation network in the Midwest adjusted routing buffers. Nothing dramatic. An extra 3 minutes added. Additional margin inserted. Slightly wider tolerances. Nobody outside operations noticed. But small defensive behaviors kept appearing. Across multiple systems. Across multiple industries. Across multiple cities. Tiny adjustments. Tiny caution. Tiny doubt. Inside the archive, Michael finally asked, what are we actually watching? Eleanor looked toward shelves filled with decades of predictions. Then answered, the return of friction. Michael looked confused. Friction. She nodded. When systems become extremely efficient. Pause. People stop noticing effort. She looked outside. Now effort is returning. Michael remained silent. Because effort sounded small. But effort changes behavior. At 3:12 p.m., the control room analyst looked toward Daniel. We have another issue. Daniel turned. What? The analyst pointed. Prediction systems requested more data. More inputs. More monitoring. More updates. The technician frowned. Why? Daniel answered quietly, because certainty became more expensive. Silence filled the room. Outside the control room windows, afternoon traffic slowly increased. People left offices. Meetings ended. Schools prepared for dismissal. The world continued. Normal. Mostly. Yet beneath ordinary movement, something small kept spreading. Not chaos. Not collapse. Something simpler. People slowly becoming harder to predict. And because humans rarely notice gradual change, almost nobody realized the dangerous part. The first casualty was attention. At 3:28 p.m. Eastern Time, the world still looked normal. That became increasingly difficult to trust. Traffic moved. Deliveries arrived. Meetings continued. Restaurants filled with afternoon customers. Nothing suggested history was happening. Which created a strange psychological problem. People started trusting appearances more than data. Inside the control room, afternoon sunlight reflected across rows of displays. The technician looked more relaxed than he had all day. He drank coffee while scrolling through infrastructure reports. No failures. He checked transportation systems. No failures. He checked utilities. No failures. He turned toward Daniel Kessler. You know what I think? Daniel remained focused. On incoming data. What? I think humans are terrible at relaxing. The analyst quietly answered, or maybe humans are good at noticing patterns. The technician shrugged. Then where is the pattern? Nobody answered immediately. Because the pattern still looked like noise. At 3:34 p.m., a grocery chain in Arizona noticed something unusual. Nothing alarming. Customers purchased slightly different products than forecast. Not dramatically. A few percentage points. Enough to require adjustments. Managers assumed weather caused it. At 3:39 p.m., a regional shipping company in Missouri adjusted staffing projections. Nothing serious. Forecasting confidence slightly lower. Extra margin added. Managers blamed seasonal variance. At 3:42 p.m., a commuter outside Philadelphia ignored navigation recommendations. Then another driver ignored them. Then thousands. Not because routes were wrong. Because drivers wanted alternatives. Most arrived at destinations normally. The navigation systems updated. Adjusted. Recalculated. Compensated. Everything still worked. Mostly. Inside the control room, new reports continued appearing. The analyst pointed toward behavioral dashboards. Recommendation acceptance continues dropping. The technician looked. Then frowned. Still. The analyst nodded. Yes. The technician looked confused. But why? Daniel answered quietly, because following requires trust. Pause. And trust changes slowly. Across the world, Eleanor Hayes stood near archive windows. Long afternoon shadows stretched across the floor. Michael Carter looked increasingly frustrated. I still do not understand what we are watching. Eleanor nodded. That is normal. No. Michael shook his head. I mean really. He pointed outside. Everything works. Pause. People still go to work. Pause. Stores still open. Pause. The world still functions. Eleanor looked outside. Yes. Michael waited. She continued, now ask a different question. What question? She answered, how much effort does it take now? Michael looked confused. What? Eleanor pointed toward pedestrians. People used to trust predictions automatically. Pause. They trusted routes. Pause. They trusted recommendations. Pause. They trusted optimization. Michael slowly nodded. So. Eleanor answered quietly, now they check. Silence. Because checking requires effort. At 3:51 p.m., search activity increased again. People comparing prices. People checking alternatives. People arriving home 6 minutes later without understanding why. People verifying recommendations. People searching before purchasing. Nothing dramatic. Just more checking. Inside the control room, Daniel noticed immediately. They are compensating. The technician looked confused. For what? Daniel pointed toward the data. Less certainty. The technician shook his head. But certainty barely changed. Daniel looked toward dozens of displays. Then answered, objectively. Pause. Subjectively feels different. At 3:46 p.m., several large optimization systems quietly requested additional resources. More data. More monitoring. More frequent updates. Machines rarely request more certainty. Today, they did. At 4:03 p.m., something even stranger happened. Prediction systems requested larger confidence intervals. Not because they became inaccurate. Because they became less confident. The analyst looked uncomfortable. We keep widening margins. The technician asked, how much? Small amounts. Then why worry? The analyst answered, because every system is doing it. That created silence. Because one cautious system means little. Thousands mean something else. Across the archive, Michael finally asked, what happens if uncertainty keeps growing? Eleanor thought carefully. Then answered, people adapt. Michael looked relieved. Good. Eleanor continued, but adaptation changes behavior. His expression changed again. That sounds bad. Eleanor shook her head slowly. Not bad. Pause. Different. Outside, afternoon slowly moved toward evening. Rush hour approached. Highways filled. Parking lots emptied. Office lights turned on. The world continued. Normal. Mostly. Inside the control room, the technician looked toward Daniel one more time. So when do people notice? Daniel watched moving data streams for several seconds. Then quietly answered, when effort becomes visible. The technician frowned. What effort? Daniel looked toward thousands of tiny decisions spreading across systems. Then answered, the effort of choosing. Because for years, people forgot something important. Convenience hides effort. Prediction hides effort. Optimization hides effort. But when certainty becomes smaller, even slightly, people start doing something dangerous. The systems noticed before humans did. At 4:21 p.m. Eastern Time, people started getting tired. Not physically. Cognitively. For the entire day, millions of people had been doing something unusual without realizing it. Checking more. Comparing more. Verifying more. Questioning more. Tiny increases. Small enough to ignore. Large enough to accumulate. And accumulation changes behavior. Inside the control room, afternoon sunlight disappeared behind clouds. Display brightness automatically adjusted. The technician rubbed his eyes. I have looked at more dashboards today than usual. The analyst did not look up. Me too. The technician frowned. Why? Nobody answered immediately. Because the answer sounded strange. Daniel Kessler finally spoke. Because certainty became expensive. Daniel rubbed his eyes. He could not remember the last time he trusted a dashboard without checking twice. The technician sighed. You keep saying that. Daniel nodded. Yes. Because it keeps being true. At 4:27 p.m., a regional retail chain noticed something unusual. Customers spent longer making decisions. Not dramatically. Seconds. Sometimes minutes. Average browsing time. Increased. Comparison behavior increased. Abandoned purchases increased slightly. Nothing serious. Managers blamed market conditions. At 4:33 p.m., navigation systems noticed something similar. Drivers increasingly requested alternative routes. Then compared them. Then changed again. Systems compensated. Predictions adjusted. Everything continued functioning. Mostly. At 4:37 p.m., corporate scheduling software generated a report. Recommendation acceptance decreased again. Not everywhere. Almost everywhere. Inside the control room, the analyst opened new graphs. Then stopped talking. The technician noticed. What? The analyst pointed. Behavior variance. Still increasing. Slowly. Consistently. The technician leaned closer. But why? Daniel answered quietly, because people are exercising something. What? Daniel looked toward moving data streams. Then answered, judgment. The technician laughed softly. That sounds dramatic. Daniel answered, it is. Across the world, Eleanor Hayes and Michael Carter walked outside the archive building. The city looked ordinary. Pedestrians moved quickly. Traffic lights changed. Buses stopped. Construction crews packed equipment. Office workers started leaving early. Michael looked around. Still normal. Eleanor nodded. Yes. Michael looked frustrated. You keep saying things changed. Yes. But everything still works. Eleanor smiled slightly. That is because people confuse function with sameness. Michael looked confused. What? She pointed toward an intersection. Cars waited. Then moved. Nothing unusual. She continued, imagine two worlds. Michael listened. In one world, people follow because they trust automatically. Pause. In another world, people follow because they choose to. Michael nodded slowly. Those sound similar. Eleanor answered quietly, they are not. At 4:49 p.m., news coverage changed again. Not headlines. Tone. Analysts sounded less confident. Commentators used more conditional language. Words like, likely. Probably. Expected. Generally. Usually. Tiny words. Small signals. Language adapts faster than institutions do. Inside the control room, Daniel watched live feeds. They feel it. The technician looked confused. Who? Everyone. At 5:02 p.m., something unexpected appeared. Decision latency increased. A customer spends 40 seconds choosing cereal. A driver spends 15 seconds reconsidering turns. A manager rechecks inventory one extra time. Seconds sound small. Millions of seconds are not. Tiny amounts. Consumers. Drivers. Managers. Schedulers. Operators. People took slightly longer before confirming choices. The analyst looked surprised. We have hesitation. The technician frowned. Hesitation. The analyst nodded. Decision time increased. The technician laughed. By how much? Seconds. The technician leaned backward. That matters. Daniel answered immediately. Yes. Pause. Multiply seconds by millions. Silence. Because millions of seconds become something larger. Across the city streets, evening traffic slowly increased. Headlights appeared. Restaurants. Filled. People called family members. People planned dinners. People stopped for groceries. Normal. Still normal. Yet beneath ordinary behavior, something invisible kept spreading. Effort. Inside the archive courtyard, Michael finally asked, "What are people actually feeling?" Eleanor looked toward commuters walking home. Then answered quietly, "They feel uncertainty." Michael nodded. "That sounds unpleasant." Eleanor shook her head. "Not always." Pause. "Sometimes uncertainty feels like responsibility." At 5:11 p.m., the technician looked toward Daniel again. "So what happens if this keeps going?" Daniel watched new behavioral reports appear. More hesitation. More checking. More variation. Then answered quietly, "People remember something." "What?" Daniel looked toward hundreds of systems slowly becoming harder to predict. Then answered, "That somebody has to decide." Outside, evening continued arriving. The world still functioned. Still moved. Still looked ordinary. And yet, for the first time in years, millions of people were slowly rediscovering something optimization had quietly hidden. Choosing always looked free. People forgot effort was the price. At 5:26 p.m. Eastern Time, evening rush hour began. Rush hour is one of civilization's largest prediction engines. Millions of strangers coordinate without speaking. Most days, it works beautifully. That was when the world finally became interesting. Not because anything failed. Because rush hour depends on prediction. Millions of people leaving buildings. Millions entering roads. Millions making decisions simultaneously. Rush hour is one of the largest prediction problems humans solve every day. And prediction had quietly become weaker. Inside the control room, traffic models updated continuously. The analyst stared at incoming data. Then leaned forward. Higher variance. The technician looked over. How much? Small. Pause. But everywhere. Highways filled. Subways filled. Bus systems filled. Parking structures emptied. Ride requests increased. Everything behaved normally. Mostly. Daniel Kessler walked closer to the displays. Prediction intervals widened again. Not dramatically. Enough to notice. The technician pointed. Traffic still works. Daniel nodded. Yes. So where is the problem? Daniel answered quietly, there is not one. Pause. There are millions. At 5:34 p.m., commuters outside Washington changed routes. Not because applications failed. Because people second-guessed them. Drivers checked suggested routes. Compared alternatives. Ignored recommendations. Then changed again. Navigation systems compensated continuously. Predictions updated. Travel times fluctuated. Still functioning. Less precise. At 5:39 p.m., grocery stores experienced something similar. Customers stopped after work. Normal. But behavior shifted. People compared more prices. Changed brands more frequently. Spent longer deciding. Nothing alarming. Managers barely noticed. Algorithms noticed. Immediately. Inside the control room, recommendation compliance metrics continued sliding. The technician stared. It still keeps happening. The analyst nodded. Yes. The technician frowned. But why today? Nobody answered immediately. Because that question mattered. Daniel finally spoke. Because people realized something. What? Daniel looked toward the displays. Following became optional. Across the world, Eleanor Hayes stood outside watching evening traffic. Headlights slowly appeared. The city changed color. Afternoon became evening. Michael Carter stood beside her. Everything still looks normal. Eleanor nodded. Yes. Michael looked toward crowded streets. So what are we watching? Eleanor pointed toward traffic. What do you see? Michael answered, cars. She shook her head. Look again. He watched more carefully. Drivers switching lanes. Pedestrians changing direction. People stopping unexpectedly. Ride-share pickups creating small delays. Tiny adjustments everywhere. Michael frowned. People. Eleanor nodded. Exactly. Pause. Prediction becomes difficult when humans remember they are humans. At 5:48 p.m., restaurants experienced unexpected timing shifts. Reservations arrived slightly early. Or slightly late. Takeout demand fluctuated. Table turnover became harder to forecast. Nothing serious. Just friction. Small delays. Small uncertainty. Small friction. For years, cities optimized humans. Today, humans started optimizing themselves again. Across hundreds of industries, tiny friction kept appearing. Seconds. Minutes. Small percentages. Almost invisible. Inside the control room, the analyst opened another display. Decision latency. Still rising. Recommendation compliance. Still falling. Behavior variance. Still rising. The technician looked increasingly uncomfortable. Should we be worried? Daniel thought carefully. Then answered, no. Pause. We should pay attention. At 5:56 p.m., news commentators noticed something. Not data. Mood. Interviews sounded different. People answered questions differently. Less certainty. More hesitation. Nobody used dramatic language. But confidence sounded weaker. Tiny emotional changes. Small signals. Language changing again. Across crowded sidewalks, commuters checked phones. Outside Columbus, the man from Ohio missed his usual exit. For several seconds he considered turning around. Instead he kept driving. He arrived home earlier. He spent the rest of the evening trying to explain why. Compared routes. Compared prices. Changed plans. Made calls. Cancelled plans. Created new plans. Nothing dramatic. Just millions of additional decisions. Michael finally asked, why does this feel important if everything still works? Eleanor looked toward moving traffic. Then answered quietly, because effort returned. Michael frowned. Effort. She nodded. For years people outsourced tiny decisions. Pause. Now they are taking them back. Michael remained silent. Because taking things back sounds positive. Until you realize responsibility. Returns with them. At exactly 6 p.m. Eastern Time, rush hour reached peak volume. Systems continued functioning. Roads continued moving. Trains continued running. Cities continued operating. Normal. Mostly. Daniel watched traffic prediction confidence decrease another fraction. Tiny. Almost meaningless. Yet still moving. He quietly spoke, there. The technician looked confused. What? Daniel answered, the first proof. Proof of what? Daniel watched millions of tiny decisions colliding across cities. Then answered softly, that freedom scales. Pause. And so does uncertainty. Outside, headlights filled highways. People drove home. Ordered food. Made plans. Changed plans. Lived normally. And almost nobody realized, the world had not become less functional. It had simply become less automatic. At 6:18 p.m. Eastern Time, the day began ending. Which should have made everyone feel better. Because people trust endings. If nothing terrible happened by evening, surely everything was fine. Across America, office lights turned off. Parking lots emptied. Commuters entered highways. Families prepared dinner. Televisions turned on. Dogs were walked. Laundry machines started. The world moved into evening exactly as it had thousands of times before. And that was the strange part. Because all day long, people waited for proof. Most never found it. Inside the control room, fewer people were speaking. Not because of fear. Because exhaustion replaced certainty. The technician sat quietly staring toward prediction dashboards. Still functioning. Still stable. Still operational. The analyst reviewed final reports. Behavior variance. Higher. Recommendation compliance. Lower. Decision latency. Higher. Prediction confidence. Lower. Not dramatically. Consistently. The technician finally broke the silence. So this is it. Daniel Kessler looked up. What? The big change. He pointed toward the displays. This? Daniel studied the screens. Then looked toward city lights outside the windows. Finally he answered, yes. The technician looked disappointed. I expected more. Daniel nodded slowly. Everyone does. At 6:31 p.m., television networks prepared evening coverage. Most headlines remained ordinary. Market stable. Transportation functioning. Infrastructure operating normally. Minor behavioral anomalies observed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing alarming. Nothing viewers could feel. Inside living rooms across the country, people relaxed. Many quietly reached the same conclusion, nothing important changed. Across social media, the jokes returned. People mocked previous warnings. People posted screenshots of normal traffic. Normal grocery stores. Normal streets. Normal schedules. Confidence returned stronger now. Because humans trust survival. If disaster does not arrive quickly, people assume danger never existed. Across the world, Eleanor Hayes stood outside the archive building. The sky slowly darkened. Streetlights turned on. Michael Carter stood beside her. You were wrong. Eleanor looked toward him. What? Michael pointed toward the city. Look. Cars moved. Restaurants filled. People laughed. People carried groceries. Nothing happened. Eleanor watched silently. Then asked, Are you sure? Michael looked confused. Yes. Eleanor pointed toward pedestrians. What are they doing? Michael answered, Going home. She nodded. And before going home? Michael frowned. What do you mean? Eleanor answered quietly, How many checked traffic twice? Pause. How many compared prices? Pause. How many changed plans? Pause. How many ignored recommendations? Michael remained silent. Because suddenly, those things felt visible. She continued. Look carefully. People crossing intersections while checking alternate routes. Drivers choosing unfamiliar roads. Parents comparing store prices. Workers messaging friends asking, What do you think? Tiny moments. Tiny effort. Tiny decisions. Everywhere. Michael looked toward the city again. This time longer. Then quietly asked, So what changed? Eleanor answered, Responsibility. Inside the control room, final system summaries arrived. Infrastructure stable. Transportation stable. Energy stable. Communication stable. The technician smiled. There. Pause. Everything survived. Daniel nodded. Yes. The technician looked relieved. So we won. Daniel remained quiet for several seconds. Then answered softly, no. The technician frowned. What? Daniel looked toward the displays one final time. Today was never the outcome. Pause. Today was only the beginning. At exactly 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the first full day ended. No collapse happened. No revolution happened. No visible transformation happened. Yet something measurable existed now. People questioned more. Checked more. Compared more. Decided more. Small differences. Repeated millions of times. Across highways, suburbs, cities, and neighborhoods, the world looked almost identical. Almost. Daniel quietly spoke while watching prediction confidence stabilize below yesterday's level. Tomorrow is dangerous. The technician frowned. Why tomorrow? Daniel answered, because tomorrow everyone wakes up believing today meant nothing. Outside, night covered highways and buildings. Windows glowed. Televisions flickered. Families ate dinner. Friends talked. People prepared for another ordinary day. And for the first time, the systems would have to react to humans they could no longer fully predict. The world changed. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Not visibly. Which meant almost nobody would defend themselves against it. Almost nobody noticed. Because sometimes, history does not begin when systems fail. History begins when systems remain functional, and people stop behaving like inputs. And tomorrow, someone, somewhere, would notice the first thing that should have been impossible. End of episode 37. Next, episode 38, The First Impossible Thing.